along with my colleague, Donovan. We are the SBAP technical chairs. Not last year, but in 2019, I was approached by someone asking questions about the use of methyl bromide in fumigating logs, and I was taken aback. I didn't know that type of activity was undertaken. And like anyone searching for information, I went to Google, found Marama, I found a white paper that kind of led me to Edward, to Pat, and to Suna. I apologize if I've mispronounced your name. And they were very gracious in providing information. In fact, an abundance of information that I had a hard time deciphering. I found out the place that had contacted me kind of didn't really need the information as much, but I thought this might be a benefit to other states, as I get the impression that this kind of activity could be moved rather easily. And permitting was somewhat of a confusing topic. How are these places permitted? What are the controls? So forth and so on. With that, I say whoever's starting first, take it away.
All right, thank you. Let me get up and sharing here. Okay, can everybody see my screen? Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you.
Okay, good, good, okay. Hi, I'm Matt Hafner. I work for the Maryland Department of the Environment Air Quality Permits Program. I'm the lead engineer of the chemical unit there. And I'm gonna discuss methyl bromide fumigation at the Port of Baltimore, go over the history a little bit, and talk about where we are today and about our permitting. So here's general, like I said, gonna go over the history, our regulations, because they're a little bit different than a lot of other states. And then the permit application, our permitting process, and some questions that we have with the current status. All right, so fumigation history at the port. Methyl bromide fumigation was occurring since the 1970s, and it was all unpermitted. Most of it was logging exports that required pre-shipment fumigation, usually to China. And when the port came to us many years ago to discuss this, they were using about 26, 37 tons a year of methyl bromide, depending on the year, and that was, of course, all uncontrolled. So here, I know not as everyone might be familiar with the city of Baltimore, but I can maybe help you out here. This is our harbor, Patapsco River, and out here is the Chesapeake Bay, and this is the port right in here. And to orient, just to see where, if you've maybe heard of things at the at Baltimore, this is Fort McHenry. This is our inner harbor, like where the stadiums are and such like that. And so this is like where our, like I said, famous inner harbor tourist area. Stadiums, Fort McHenry, and then we have a lot of residences right here, and a lot of industry on this side, but the port where the fumigation's occurring is right in this area. This is down here, sort of like our chemical plant area of the port, but the shipping area is on this side of the harbor. So the port came to us back in 2011, and they submitted a permit to construct application after realizing this was uncontrolled for so long. And it was determined that despite the major source usage of methyl bromide, it was not going to be major NSR or case-by-case MACT due to the fact that it qualified under historical grandfathered clause. That so it wasn't, so at least we were, going to get past the federal standard there. However, based on our current state regulations, we could not approve any permit for that much methyl bromide. So then we started working with them, and they started looking at a control system, and they found one control system from a company called Value Recovery, and it was going to be cost prohibitive to them. You can see those numbers there, 1.6 million a year, 21,000 per ton destroyed. And so they decided to end the fumigation operations after 5 years of attempting to, get a permit for the process that had been going on there for 30 years. And so I'm going to talk about the regulations about why methyl bromide couldn't be permitted at those levels in Maryland. Methyl bromide is a VOC, but in Maryland it is also a TAP, and that's a toxic air pollutant. Separate from the federal HAPs, but a similar idea. We have a regulation that in Baltimore City requires sources to emit less than 20 pounds a day of VOC or install controls that are greater than 85%. So if they're fumigating uncontrolled methyl bromide at the levels they weren't going to meet our 20 pounds a day, and they could not find a control device that worked for them. So right away, they couldn't meet that standard. And then we also have our toxic air pollutant ambient impact requirement standard. And I'll discuss that in more detail, but they were going to have trouble meeting that as well. So our toxic air pollutant impact requirement is based on emissions at the property line and the concentration in the air that reaches the property line. And for methyl bromide, we have an 8-hour screening level of 38.84 micrograms per meters cubed. And that screening level is based off of the ACGIH time-weighted average of 1 ppm. And our toxic air pollutant regulations take those time-weighted average values, and it's 1/100th of those to protect public health. So we basically say that the worker exposure is 1 ppm. Off-site to the general public, we want it to be 1/100th of that. So it's a very, very strict regulation. And to comply with that, we have a tiered compliance demonstration. And the first tier is based off an allowable emission rate. And we calculate that based on what the screening level is. And that basically says if the emission rate is less than 0.14 pounds per hour, then you're done. You're in compliance with the regulation. Beyond that, you're probably going to need modeling to demonstrate compliance. And, general back of the envelope calculations showed that a control device was going to be required if they were going to continue to emit methyl bromide at the levels they were. So fast forward a little bit to 2019, the Port of Baltimore and a company, Lanadeer USA, came to us with a proposal that they wanted to look at fumigating what they called emergency action notifications. And these are quarantines of imported shipping containers. So this is different than the export fumigations that they were doing for 30 years. These are containers that come in and have to be fumigated or shipped back. They are not allowed into the port otherwise. And they were estimating that this would happen 1 to 2 times a week. And they wanted to look at fumigating these containers, much smaller scale operation. And they were looking into a control device called a Nordico carbon absorption system. And the EANs, what they called the emergency action notifications, they called them EANs, were at most looking at 2 standard 40-foot shipping containers treating with methyl bromide for 24 hours. They were thinking that that was the maximum they were going to be using. So they were looking at this Nordico system and thought that could provide appropriate controls. However, before they wanted to go through the permitting process, they conducted 2 trials in the end of 2019. And those trials demonstrated significant control of methyl bromide. So it showed very promising results. Here's the Nordico system. So those tubes are hooked up to the container, and those big squares or big cubes here are the carbon absorption filters. And so it sucks out the methyl bromide and captures it in the carbon absorption and then emits the cleaner air, the cleaned air. Here's another view of the Nordico. And then here are the ports on the side of the container where they hook up the system. So we went through the permitting process with them, and what we came up with was a very limited permit. So they are permitted only for emergency action notifications. They have a hard cap of 5.5 tons of methyl bromide used per year, 2 containers at a time, 400 containers a year. And they're supposed to be pressure testing, or all the containers that come in have to have a pressure test done on them, or they have to be tarped. And that's to prevent fugitive leaks during the fumigation. We have extensive monitoring during the fumigation and the control portion. We have requirements for filter replacements, and they have to notify the department if they are using more than 55 pounds of methyl bromide per fumigation. And that 55 pounds was based off of their maximum estimate based on USDA regulations of fumigating the 2 containers. So we do have some questions about the process still. And basically, during the research and trial process, Lanadeer submitted a study from the Nordico system that found 20% fugitive loss during the fumigation process. And we were very concerned with that because 20% is a lot, especially if they try to scale the system up. However, we did do some calculations, and where the facility is located, they can comply with our toxic air pollutant requirements, even assuming 20% fugitive loss. During the trials, they only estimated that less than 4% was being lost. However, their estimate was based off of 6 concentrations inside, like randomly placed inside the container, and averaging those concentrations. And, so after the fumigation, they know what they put into the container, and the fumigation's over, 24-hour period's over. It's about to start the control device. What is the concentration at that point? And they were estimating only up to 4% was lost. But like I said, there was an average of 6 sensors inside the container. So it's not exactly hard evidence of that's the only amount of methyl bromide in the container. So we're still looking at that, and we have monitors that they're set up for that are supposed to be monitoring how much is going into the control device. And they have a lot of record keeping and monitoring requirements on the control device, where they have to replace the filters whenever they reach a certain concentration. And we'll know how many fumigations they're doing and how much they're putting in. So after they use this system for a while, we'll have a much better idea of what the fugitive loss is for this system. But however, the main point is that the trial showed that we have a high confidence that a lot of methyl bromide is being controlled from the Nordico system, which gave us, allowed us to move forward with this happily. And the Nordico control device, so we put in time that the filters must be changed. We discussed that with them. We came up with we worked out a compromise with them about how often they need to be changed, so there was no breakthrough. And then the disposal is still our biggest question. It's not necessarily an air problem, but those carbon filters are a hazardous material once they're full. And the last we heard, they had still not settled on a disposal method. So we actually don't have a cost estimate for how much the control device actually costs, because they were estimating that the disposal was going to be one of the higher costs for the entire project. So current status, we confirmed today that they have only conducted one EAN so far since we gave them the permit last June. So we do not have any of the good data that we are hoping for yet. They still are interested in expanding fumigation operations. So we are continuing to work with them, and we'll be discussing any expansion, whether they want to, bring in exports or just more imports beyond emergency notifications. We're going to be looking at that. And so again, and as I said before, we're looking forward to getting data from these fumigations. We know a lot about the filters, but they need to be used, and we need this process to be consistent for us to get this data, and which at this point we just don't have that. And that is all I have. So I'd be happy. I don't know. I can't remember if we decide to take questions now or later, but I'd be happy to do questions now.
Okay, so any questions from the group? If not, we can move on. Okay, so go ahead and either type them in or just unmute and ask.
Thank you. Appreciate it. I really find this presentation revealing. Actually, thank you for bringing it to us, and thank you for the presenter. It was really clear and very nicely done. I have a few questions as I worked on methyl bromide under the exemption for VOCs, and we were having a lot of back and forth on this particular chemical. So I have a few questions for you as you.
Sure.
You raised a lot of very, very good, I think, questions that could be really personally of concern. First things, why do they present it as an emergency case only? So do they have other alternatives to use for fumigation?
No, not that. These are specifically required methyl bromide by USDA, is our understanding. And the USDA does have some exemptions to the methyl bromide ban, which we've discussed in our fumigation groups before. So no, methyl bromide is required, and it's an emergency because they have 1 week to either fumigate it or ship it out of the port. So that's why it's declared an emergency.
Okay, and then now looking at also on the control side, is there a way, do they present any technology of recovering methyl bromide? Because it seems like they are able to recapture it.
Yes. So apparently the recovering it from the filter is also very expensive. And that is what the other controlled system that they looked at several years ago by a company called Value Recovery, they actually recover the methyl bromide from the carbon filter. And that's one of the reasons it makes it very expensive. They were hoping that hazardous waste disposal would actually be cheaper, again, what they've talked to us about.
Yeah, I think that's where the concern is, because all what you are trying to do by controlling it this way is you're transferring, the toxic chemical from a medium to another medium. That's all we are doing. So if we are going to destroy it by burning or doing something else, we're going to have another issue. And this is like a vicious circle. That's why I think we have been having really a big problem even thinking about exempting it, because they were pushing towards it. And I do recall, I think there were other issues because some states or some areas were using some reductions for, I think, methyl bromide as their way of showing how they can meet the standard. So if you take it down, then they will not be able to use it as, a candidate for them to show that they really did reduce VOC emissions. And that was one of the dilemma we had when we were actually trying to discuss whether it could be exempted from the VOC definition. However, I have another question for you since you are very well involved. Are there any other issues with uh, people who work with methyl bromide? What is the exposure there? How is
Yeah, you know, that I mean, that is a concern. That's one of the reasons um, our screening level as toxic air pollutant is quite low. Is methyl bromide is very toxic. So they do have a lot of safety standards about, you know, no one being no one being around when they're using it, and it has to be quarantined off, and we went over this with them when they were doing their trials, you know, because we were concerned about, you know, we didn't know how well it was going to work. So, you know, if they don't control it, you know, they're going to run afoul of our toxic air pollutant regulations. So, you know, when they're doing a trial for the control device, you know, we had a lot of discussions with them about that, and they outlined during the trial approval, we had some additional safety standards put in there to protect any workers at the port.
Yep, that's just to conclude, I think my questions, that's something I wanted to alert you to because there were some EJ issues or environmental justice issues with this particular chemical. So that's something to keep in mind. And thank
Yes.
you so much. I'm going to leave it to other people, I think, to have the chance to ask questions.
I see a question in the chat about technology beyond the capture system. And from what I understand is that Nordico and Value Recovery, I think, are the only systems that are commercially available right now for methyl bromide control of fumigation.
Matt, this is
So-
Pat Corbett. Sorry, I had just replied to the chat while you were
Yep.
talking, and I hit return. And somebody can correct me if my understanding isn't current, but as I typed in the chat, that there are lots of rules around using the materials you can use for fumigations, and reuse of methyl bromide. The last I heard was you weren't allowed to do that for fumigation activities.
Yeah.
So that's one of the reasons that hasn't really taken off. It's been a big discussion topic, at least since I've been involved in fumigation for 6 or 7 years.
Yeah, so this is Sana Sarasak. I'm also from the Maryland Department of Environment's Air Quality Permits Program. And I just wanted to chime in a little bit about the sealed system question that you had. So the way, what Pat was saying, and, the way the fumigation process is, it's prescribed by USDA. There's a very specific way methyl bromide is supposed to be injected, how long it dwells in the containers, and then there's a series of air washes. So there's higher concentrations of air that are brought in with each, flushing out of the system. And so it couldn't be a sealed system. It has to go through some level of medium that pulls the methyl bromide out, so that the air is not contaminated with methyl bromide when it exhausts out. So you can't exactly capture the methyl bromide in a sealed system because there's just a number of air washes and evacuations that need to occur to complete the entire fumigation process that's prescribed by USDA. And then even if after you capture it, like what Pat was saying, as far as I know, there aren't they're not allowed to reuse or recycle it at this time.
Anybody else? All right, well, thank you very much. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen here and let everybody move on.
Okay, I think we're going to me. Okay, can you see my screen? Hopefully.
Yep, we're good to go, Edward.
Okay, great. Thanks. Hi. I'm Ed Wiener. I work for the City of Philadelphia Air Management Services. I'm the chief of the permitting and testing group. Just brief presentation, a little bit on the history of permitting methyl bromide fumigation in Philadelphia. Didn't think to add a history slide, so let me do that here. We've only been permitting these sources in recent years. We only issued a few permits to date. Throughout history, they kind of fell through the cracks. I think EPA Region 3 was digging into this going back several years, and they inspected all of the ports in various cities in the region, actually found a few operations that were going on at the time in Philadelphia. A little bit later, those, I think they all ultimately shut down. We did a information request to some of the main fumigators that we were aware of. None of them had anything going at that time, but when we've been periodically getting applications since then as new things have started up in the ports. Evaluating fumigation permit applications, it's a little unique. First, at least in Philadelphia, we don't have specific regulations. Certain other, Maryland indicated they have one. I believe Virginia actually has some as well. We don't have anything specific covered by fumigation. Also, while there are controls, has been mentioned, there aren't very many out there in practice to my knowledge. There was like a California was something out there, was as my understanding, they're kind of the vanguards to it, and I'm not even sure if that's still operating. I think there was something in Florida for a while. Maryland mentioned that they've got something, but as a general rule, there isn't a lot out there that is controlled, at least to our knowledge. So our way of dealing with this is we're mostly focused on modeled ambient air levels. And to do this, we look at our Air Management Regulation 6. This is a regulation that covers toxic air contaminants, which are essentially the equivalent of HAPs for EPA. We have a list of 99 in our regulation. I think all or 99% of them are also HAPs under EPA. It's an old regulation, I think dating back to the 80s. When it was started, it was mostly a reporting regulation where facilities that used one of the toxic air contaminant had to do some reporting to us, submit a form. As time went on and we started capturing this information in permit applications and emission inventories, the reporting aspect of it kind of become less important. However, it also had some ambient air quality guidelines, including some methyl bromides are toxic in the regulation, one for methyl bromide. So we will use that to evaluate. That's kind of our main thing at these days that we use to when evaluating permit applications. Any permit application for methyl bromide fumigation is going to require some type of modeling, typically screen modeling. The contractors will typically submit it for the facilities. We look at the results and we want them all within the ambient air level limit in our AMR 6 guidelines. If everything is out past the property line is less than that, that's fine. If it's above that, the facility has to make changes to their application and submit new modeling to get something that's acceptable. And then when we convert these into permits, basically the details of the application become various types of permit limits. So the obvious things are emission limits. If they say they're going to emit 5 tons per year, we're going to make that a limit. However, we also look at it short term. And essentially anything that was used in the model to show that it's not going to cause ambient air levels above the thresholds in our guidance document, we're going to make that an emission limit. So sort of in addition to annual limits, it'll be hourly limits, and also make it batch limits or batch sizes. For uncontrolled methyl bromide, we assume basically whatever they use, we assume is emitted within an hour. I think that's the standard practice. So if the application and the modeling is based on 200 pounds per hour or 20 pounds per hour, that becomes an emission limit and a batch size limit. Batch numbers per year, stack and exhaust details. If it's based on a 20-foot stack with this size, this amount of exhaust rate, we actually spell it out in the permits, which we don't usually do for other types of permits. Distance to the property line, we will also include that in, and require the facility to keep various records to document the records of the amount that they use, calculations for the stacks and fans and certain whatever certifications they can come up with just to show that they meet the levels they're supposed to. And this is our way of just kind of making sure that the process going forward keeps the ambient levels in a level that's considered acceptable and not dangerous. That's just about it. This is changing a little bit. We're looking to amend our Air Management Regulation 6 to include a risk analysis aspect for permits. It's based heavily on what New Jersey currently does, if anybody's familiar with that. All of the toxic air contaminants in the regulation, and we're also adding EPA's HAP list, created threshold levels based on, and I wasn't involved in it, just levels which could create air concentrations that would be a concern. If you emit above a threat, if you submit an application with emissions above a threshold from one of the pollutants, then you actually have to look at risks. So it would be methyl bromide above whatever the methyl bromide threshold is in the regulation. I think it's pretty low. As part of the risk analysis, they would do determine the cancer risk per million people. They would also do a health quotient for those that are not, to determine non-cancer risk. And I believe that's the case with methyl bromide. For these, we actually plan to use for methyl bromide a slightly different level than what's in our regulation 6. It would be more a level that we understand that Pennsylvania has been using. So yeah, and basically the way it works out for cancer risk, if it's, or at least the way we're proposing it, if it's something's 1 in a million or better, it's automatically acceptable. If it's 100 in a million or worse, it's automatically not acceptable. Anything within that range, we see what we'll plan to nudge the facility to see what we can get them to do to improve things. But ultimately it might be something that we can approve. And that's it. That's quick. Yeah, that's all I have. In summary, it's in Philadelphia, we've done pretty basic stuff. Particularly the permits we've issued to date. There's a couple of applications currently in various stages that get to be a little bit more involved. We have not issued those yet. Yes. Any questions? Okay.
I'm not seeing any.
Okay.
So certainly appreciate that, Ed.
No problem. I will stop share.
All right, this is Pat Corbett. I'm sharing my screen and also putting myself back on mute as I take myself off of mute. So, all right. Hopefully everybody can see my presentation nicely.
Yep, you're up.
All right, my name is Pat Corbett. I work in the Office of Air Permit Programs for Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. I'm the Air Toxics Coordinator, though I have delved into a variety of topics in my time. Today, I'm just gonna kind of run through Virginia's experience with fumigation, specifically air permitting of fumigation activities within the state. You've obviously heard Maryland and Philly's presentations. I believe that we were one of the states that started this whole thing off. Let's see if I can advance the slides. Okay, so fumigation. USDA, I'm just going to give you some generic outline. I'm not sure what everybody knows on the webinar, so just a generic outline. USDA has regulations around fumigation. APHIS, or the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, APHIS, oversees fumigation, and they have a manual, QPS manual, that outlines the types of fumigants that are used for any fumigation of any commodity that comes into the country, and how much of that fumigant must be used, like the concentration in the air around the commodity, and then the type of fumigant that can be used. And there are a number of them. So they're basically, USDA kind of lays out the general requirements. FIFRA, I'm not going to read you the act. There's lots of big words. I wouldn't want to say them incorrectly. But FIFRA is the act that gives EPA's Office of Pesticide Programs the ability to develop what are essentially called labels. Each fumigant for a particular use has a label, and that label tells the fumigator what to do, how big of a buffer zone is necessary, how long does something have to be fumigated, how long does something have to be aerated. And the intent of the label is to create legally enforceable requirements, right? So the label can be enforced on the fumigators, and it's to ensure the safety of employees and the public. So those two different entities are regulating fumigation operations. Then in comes the Clean Air Act. Methyl bromide is the one that we talk in the regulatory authorities. We talk most frequently about methyl bromide, but phosphine is another fumigant that is used, and they're both listed hazardous air pollutants, or HAPs, if I say that, under Section 112 of the Clean Air Act. So they're federally regulated hazardous air pollutants. Methyl bromide also happens to meet the definition of a volatile organic compound, VOC. And so while USDA and OPP have regulations and requirements for fumigation activities, nothing exempts these two pollutants from being regulated just because they're used and regulated elsewhere for fumigation activities. So that brings in case-by-case MACT, or maximum achievable control technology. It's Section 112G. If I say that 112G, I'm talking about a case-by-case MACT, M-A-C-T, MACT requirement, and they apply to the construction of a major source, major operations for hazardous air pollutants, and essentially that's the construction of a 10-ton per year source. Right. So if what we're talking about, a fumigation activity, is going to emit 10 tons or more of methyl bromide, which is a hazardous air pollutant, they'd be subject to this program. The types of fumigation in Virginia, again, I'm only talking about methyl bromide and phosphine. I'm not getting into, the variety of other fumigation and fumigants that are out there. But we've seen, flour silos at a food plant, they have to be fumigated, about once a year. Peanuts are fumigated, hams, tobacco is fumigated for export. And the one that we talk about most are log fumigation. And the reason is that the APHIS manual that I described in my first slide requires a large amount of methyl bromide to be used to fumigate logs. So they're the big users and the big emitters. And so I believe that's what we're all talking about here, is log fumigation. So Virginia's experience has been a long path. We had in 2006, there were 2 log fumigation facilities that constructed and began operation without permits. So they never came to us. They understood that USDA and OPP's label requirements covered them. So they were not aware that they needed anything from, for air quality regulation. So they both conducted log fumigations using methyl bromide, and they both emitted 25 tons. One of them was a little bit more than that. I think it was about 40 tons of methyl bromide a year. So that started in 2006. obviously, that's construction of a major source of hazardous air pollutants. So that triggered when we found out about that facility a couple of years later, which happens, and this is one thing to think about, is methyl bromide is a colorless, odorless gas. You know, it can be used next to other facilities or other locations without really anybody knowing. So we had no way, it's just a warehouse. You know, they're not high-tech operations, these fumigation operations. So it's essentially putting a bunch of logs into a warehouse and hitting them with this fumigant to kill any pests. So you drive by, it just looks like a warehouse. So they construct a major HAP source, and it triggers this case-by-case MACT requirement. What's the problem with this case-by-case MACT requirement? It's a federal program, okay, so it applies in every state in the US. And it is a very stringent program. All right, there's legal requirements and process for determining what a source has to do that is subject to this type of permit. And this first bullet kind of discusses the general idea. It shall not be less stringent than the control achieved by the best controlled similar source. All right, and that decision is based on whatever available information the state or locality that's regulating or issuing this case-by-case MACT permit has in front of it. It is very complex when you have a clear understanding, but the biggest problem specifically with fumigation is this term best controlled similar source. It's vague, and you have to decide for each activity that you happen to be looking at, what is a similar source. And so it's a very time consuming process in addition to being very stringent. So, you know, major issues with a 112G permit or a case-by-case MACT permit is that when you're looking at this first bullet here, I'm going back a slide, sorry, that, you know, it shall not be less stringent. It can be more stringent, but the law says it shall not be less stringent. So there's no costs when you're considering what is that minimum stringency, what we call the MACT floor. You cannot consider costs when you're looking at that. What you have to do is you have to figure out what is a similar source. And for fumigation, you know, is it any fumigation activity? Is it each commodity? Is it a commodity in an area? And those are all discussions that regulating authorities and sources have. You know, there are arguments back and forth about what can or should be done, what's required. And again, like I said, that takes time. So after basically we found out about the facility in about 2010, and we went to public notice with a permit after all the iterations and research in 2016. So 6 years of working to figure out how to apply this case-by-case MACT program to log fumigation. And the draft permit we went to notice with required controls. I think Matt's presentation from Maryland mentioned value recovery. I think Ed also said that's the only operating control system that I'm aware of on an ongoing basis on a regular operation, but it doesn't apply to logs. It's for broccoli, I believe, in California, which, you know, costs are going to be different depending on the commodity. A cheap commodity like logs is going to have a different cost relationship and ability to sustain operation of controls than broccoli, which may get a higher premium. So we went to notice. We did end up requiring controls, 90% control of the methyl bromide emissions that they wanted to have, and the sources, which their argument had been all along that these controls were going to put them out of business, and they ended up withdrawing the application, shutting down their operation. So the permit was never issued. You know, that's a real quick overview of 6 years of a lot of work, both by the source and by Virginia. You can imagine these guys already had some operation, but that program is very difficult for a new facility to come in before getting a permit, before, you know, constructing their facility or beginning operation. They have to get this permit. So, you know, having to wait 6 years for that type of permit isn't really in anybody's business plan. So I know Virginia and Maryland and Philadelphia, along with other states, have tried to work with the federal government over several administrations to get EPA to promulgate an actual nationwide standard, you know, a MACT standard that would apply to fumigation operations. You know, the idea being that once EPA promulgates a nationwide standard, this case-by-case program goes away. And to date, you know, that hasn't happened. We're still hopeful. We still continue to talk with EPA as we get the chance. So in Virginia, you know, we needed to be able to move forward and issue permits or not issue permits, as the case might be. And our legislature in 2011 passed a law called the Qualified Fumigation Facilities, regulated qualified fumigation facilities. It exempted minor ones. So anybody that wasn't a major fumigation facility was exempted from permitting in Virginia. It does require, you know, notifications to DEQ, posting of signage to let people know what's going on in the facility. And then there are 3 compliance options: a 300-foot buffer zone. You can utilize capture and control during aeration. Aeration is the part when Sana was talking about having airflow through the container. That's aeration, where you're trying to clean the air inside the container and push all of the fumigant outside. And then you can also monitor the fence line. So, you know, when somebody's a major source and they're not exempted under that QFF legislation, they don't want to be subject to the case-by-case MACT permitting. So they ask for what's called synthetic minor status via limitations. And what that is we issue a permit that has federally enforceable limitations that keeps them below that 10 tons per year. And as part of that, we utilize the General Assembly's law, those 3 requirements, as the options to demonstrate compliance with our state toxics rule that regulates methyl bromide and phosphine. So one of the biggest questions is, how do you determine whether what potential to emit is for an operation? Generally, we just take the highest hourly emissions and we multiply that by 8760 and we divide it by 2000 to turn it into a tons per year number. It's very straightforward, but fumigation has, you know, it might last for 5 days, where they inject the fumigant into the container and then they have to wait 72 hours. And then the requirements are that they then aerate for 24 hours. You know, so they're extended periods of time. These things, they may leak and have fugitive emissions, as Matt was saying in his presentation, but generally it's an extended period of time, and how many events are enough, or how many events per year are the right number. And then you have to cover different types of fumigation operations, like the once-a-year flour mill versus a log operation that wants to operate as much as possible. So and to that effect on potential to emit, we did create a guidance document that lays out how Virginia will calculate fumigation potential to emit, because it was very complex and it's an important part of, and really the integral part of, whether you're exempt from permitting or exempt from case-by-case MACT. So when we permit them, we give them the 3 options. Again, fence line monitoring, controls for log fumigation. Again, log fumigation, as I said at the beginning, is really the fumigation activity that gets the most you know, time in the spotlight, because they use so much methyl bromide and they trigger that 10 ton per year, or they're more likely to trigger that 10 ton per year threshold. So, but logs aren't a very, you know, high margin commodity, so sources don't generally consider the controls are going to be very effective for them. So they often will just select the 300-foot buffer. they find a location that's away from everybody and anything, even other, industries, and they use that 300-foot buffer and, compliance with the label to demonstrate that they're not endangering anybody. And that's essentially how we issue the permits. We require signage so that people know what's going on, and site maps for the buffer to ensure that the fumigation activity is actually occurring such that it has a 300-foot buffer. And that is, in the end, how Virginia has handled permitting those synthetic minor sources. Since the original case-by-case MACT activity, we have not had any such activity because the facilities that had done that, built without permits, understood the process now, and they started to become involved with us early. So that has worked nicely. And that was it. I think I kept us close to the the 3 o'clock mark. Sorry if I rambled a little bit too quickly through that. But
that's fine, Pat. We do have a few questions that came in through the chat. First, were the question from earlier on, were the unpermitted sources fine, and if so, about how much?
Oh, that's something I didn't look into. I mean, I know that we issued notices of violation. We did fine them. We had consent orders. There was a whole enforcement process. But honestly, I do not know the answer to that question.
Okay. And this one appears to be a little bit more generalized for the group out there. Aside from a port, what other areas might you be likely to find methyl bromide fumigation operations?
So that's interesting, because in the beginning, when I first got involved, I started in this role in 2014, even though obviously the activity was going on quite before then. It really was just in the port and around the port, just because transportation costs. And then as they realized, as the operators realized that they needed to have more access to be able to fumigate, commodities, they started looking for sites that were further away. Really anywhere I've heard, and I haven't been involved in it, but people were asking me questions from other states. I used to get a lot of calls about this, from states all up and down the eastern seaboard over to the Mississippi about, trying to fumigate logs at the mill. So, they rough cut the timber and they put it in a container and they fumigate it there, which obviously goes west of, West Virginia. And I think as the eastern seaboard states have started talking to each other about this activity, and we've started to get on national calls, and other regulatory authorities have heard about this. And as Ed noted, EPA has gotten involved, obviously, as it's a federal program. The activity, they're always looking for places that are away from people to ensure that there are no, issues with any kind of public health activities. And so that's kind of how they've been moving further and further away from the ports based on that, usually along rail lines, or like I said, at a mill, where it's relatively easy for them.
All right,
Yeah, if I can add real quick, we actually had a fumigator initially ask us about, or say they had a pending log fumigation operation that they were going to do in the port. And they later told us that, yeah, it was decided to actually do it at the other end, like near where they were cutting the logs. So.
And this does go up and down in importance, simply because, I forget when it was, but when the tariffs with China started to hit, there were some backlash on log fumigations that did require a number of activities from the fumigators. So all those things it's more than just a single activity. Lots of things get involved because you're exporting and importing.
All right, excellent. That actually answered the next question about if they were relocated. And this appears to be a general comment. In Kansas, they had a candy manufacturer fumigating nuts that came into use in the candy back in the 90s. Not sure they still use methyl bromide or not. They also had a company install a fumigation unit for their pallets in the early 2000s that evidently didn't last. But they plan to do that for export shipping. So here's another question. What type of records might be required in permits? Like, are there usage records or a number of containers or such?
So in Virginia, we have generally had the 300-foot buffer activity. So yes, you would need to keep track of your amount that you've used, because you need to be able to demonstrate that you haven't exceeded that 10 ton per year threshold that I mentioned for case-by-case MACT permitting, and not violated our limitations. If you're doing any monitoring, you would have to keep records of the monitoring. We haven't had anybody go down that path very far yet, but as monitoring technology gets better, that might become. I know that they're working on monitors that would be available to operate 24/7, ambient monitors. So you would have to keep those types of records. The label, because that's something that might be kept. I'm trying to think. Going off the top of my head, I apologize. If anybody wants to jump in, that'd be great.
Okay. Yeah, we're similar things. Usage is definitely one in Philadelphia, both rolling 12-month, also just on a batch by batch basis, since we have typically have batch size limits in the permits for the pounds per hour records. The other thing I can think of that's a little unique for us, since ours was based on modeling, we will actually have the facility keep records of things like some type of documentation that yes, the stack is a certain height, and yes, the fan is a certain amount. One kind of unique thing with this, usually when you need to worry about a pounds per hour limit, you have you'll do stack testing. We've found out in this that apparently it's not particularly safe to have stack testers up on a stack that's venting, uncontrolled methyl bromide fumigation. So that option isn't available. So basically, any type of documentation the facility can prepare just to show like all the details in their modeling that they're meeting, the actual installed equipment is meeting it.
All right, I think. Go ahead, Pat.
Oh, I was just going to say it, and this obviously is only from the air permitting perspective. The USDA has requirements, and I'm not an expert in the label by any stretch of the imagination. So those other regulatory bodies might have additional requirements too.
Okay, and a pair of questions to wrap things up. Any Marama work group activity updates, and also where would one get methylene bromide, because it seems like it would be difficult to obtain?
The first one, there's no work group activity that I'm aware of. There, like I said, this is we've elevated this through to EPA, and I believe EPA, along with some states, have really pushed for a national work group, and the Marama work group has kind of been folded into that. There's no reason to duplicate effort, given that I don't think any of us have a plethora of resources right now. So it's more of a national. Good.
Yes, thank you, Pat. I recall, I think in 2019, there was a white paper about fumigation that was released by the Mid-Atlantic Regional Air Management Association. And I recall you guys, you are all, I think, Maryland, Virginia, if I'm not wrong, and then Philadelphia were involved. And there was a request for a MACT for methyl bromide that didn't follow. I mean, for a lot of reasons. I'm not going to go. I mean, I work at EPA, but I'm not in the permitting, and I'm not also at the MACT program. But I was just looking for information because of the exemption of methyl bromide from the VOC definition, and that's how I got the information. And that's why I was interested to see whether there were any follow-ups on what happened, because they did request a MACT. What happened with it? The only information I had at the time that North Carolina in particular has requested the standard for methyl bromide, and I think it was under review by the SAB. And I was just curious to see whether there's any follow-up on that, even though, I mean, I see there's a lot of interest and it's a dilemma, I mean, for a lot of people. To see how to get any permitting done with this particular chemical. And that was why I asked the question.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
this is, oh, go ahead, Pat.
No, Sana, go ahead. I've talked enough.
Yeah, so yeah, that is true. I think all of us worked on that white paper with Marama. They tried to we were trying to petition OAQPS EPA to try and develop a national MACT, because all of these states were having this issue where it was just being pushed to other states. They left Maryland. Maryland was too strict, so they tried to go to Virginia. Virginia's too strict, they tried to go to North Carolina, etc. So this is really the main reason for a national rule. And but right now, like what Pat was saying, we've been kind of folded into a national work group, and there hasn't been any update or activity. It's just sort of stagnant at this point. But we all know, like all of the Mid-Atlantic states have been kind of working together. We all know what we're requiring, and Maryland's existing state regulations are so stringent that they really can't come here. And they've a lot of the contractors that conduct methyl bromide fumigation have actually approached, our governor and our secretary, stating that Maryland is too strict and that they can't come to our state. So, I think it's right to expect that they might go to other more inland states to conduct these activities, but which is why we're trying to push for this national regulation. But as far as I know, we haven't had an update in a while, probably since the white paper, and since they said that they weren't pursuing a national rule at this time.
All right. Well,
As to where I have no idea, Mark, where you buy methyl bromide. I know that there are, I'm 99% sure, I guess no is a strong word, that there are licensing requirements and all types of things, but yeah, I don't think you can get it at Home Depot. Let's say that.
no.
This is Mark Stoddard with Indiana. Actually, I had a conversation with the Office of the Indiana State Chemist. They regulate FIFRA in Indiana. And they did mention that there was a local provider of methyl bromide. They didn't indicate what quantities they stock. I assume that for like logs, you're probably maybe buying ton cylinders or 500 pounds or 100 pounds. And then for smaller commodities, you might be buying in smaller units. But I kind of wondered, because it would seem like, being a registered pesticide product, that it couldn't be sold anywhere, and it couldn't be sold just to anyone. You'd have to be a licensed practitioner.
Yeah, that's my understanding too. And on as your point about 1-ton cylinders, I don't know the size of the cylinders, but for example, there are some phosphine fumigation operations that use in 20 grams. So there's 453 grams per pound. So you're talking very small quantities of phosphine. And then obviously, I believe it's 15 pounds per 1,000 cubic feet is the number for log fumigation. It might be off though. Don't quote me on that. It's all in the manual that I mentioned on my first slide.
I want to thank everyone who has participated. Patrick and Sana and Matt and Edward, thank you very much for taking time to present, to prepare, and to answer questions that we have from, well, from myself, who was very perhaps naive in you know, the extent of this operation, where it's taking place, and maybe what we should expect, or maybe how we might react, maybe to better prepare someone who is contemplating perhaps a relocation further inland.
My pleasure. I hope it wasn't too unintelligible.
No, I thought it was great. Thank you very much.